It is a distinct honor as well as an eminent privilege to speak to Marquette University today. And before we get too deep into this, I want to thank the O'Brien Fellowship for Public Service Journalism. I want to thank our director, Dave Umhafer. Thank you very much. Also, the team of students who serve as interns for this project, John Liuzzi, Xiang Fu, and Andrew Amuzu, who helped with the research on this presentation and also are the executive producers of this presentation. They did the PowerPoint and the formulation of the message, helping with that as well. I also want to thank my fellow fellows who are here to support me. They're doing some magnificent work. I can't wait to share that, for them to share that with the public. So I thank you for taking time out of your schedules to be here with us today. My name is Lee Hawkins. I'm an O'Brien Fellow, and I'm a journalist, and most of my work recently and for the foreseeable future is centered around a few key areas, but mainly centering on how America's legacy of racial violence, governmentally codified racism and racial violence, has contributed to generations of childhood trauma and accelerated aging and early death among African Americans, descendants of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. And at the outset, I want to present and provide much needed background on a term that tends to make people very uncomfortable and even polarize and divide many of us and shut down conversations if we allow it to. I'm not here to do that today. The tension around this term is one of the reasons I believe that conversations about race and racism in America are often so fraught. Because in order to even begin to discuss racism, we must all, across races and across partisan lines, agree on one indisputable and undeniable fact that makes this topic so hard to digest. What is that fact? That from 1619 to 1965, for all but 58 years of its existence, America has rested on a foundation of legal white supremacy. That term, white supremacy, is one that can trigger the end of a conversation about race because so many of us were not taught or did not process or refuse to process the fact that our country created and codified laws that intentionally and systematically gave white supreme status above all others. That allowed for 17 generations of African families to be enslaved from 1619 to 1863, and for another 5 generations to live under a system of Jim Crow segregation. So that was all the way up to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So allow just yourself to put this in perspective, that those laws, wasn't until then that segregation that had been institutionalized by Jim Crow laws that halted efforts keeping minorities from voting and made discrimination in renting and the sale of homes illegal. I know that sounds super rudimentary and basic, but we thought that it was important to revisit these details to explain that this is what we mean when we say white supremacy. When we're talking about white supremacy in that context, it is not a political ideology, it is not an agenda, and it's not an opinion. It's a fact. It's a fact that white supremacy has been the law of this land for centuries. Even I've had a really hard time digesting that, and it took me a long time. For as much studying as I've done, and I majored in political science, I still had a hard time comprehending that fact until I started research for my book, Nobody's Slave: How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free, which required me to go back to trace my family history back to the 1600s. And it wasn't until then that I realized that my father, a Vietnam-era Air Force veteran, was born in 1948 in a town called Greenville, Alabama, into the system of Jim Crow, which meant that I had privileges at least on paper, that my father and his forefathers and foremothers didn't have. This is the mind-blowing fact that we all have to take into account when we come across African Americans in this country. I didn't realize that I am the first generation, or part of the first generation in my family, to be born with voting rights, even though we've been here since the 1600s. So I'm the first generation to be born with the same rights afforded to whites in America, at least on paper. That means the equality of blacks is a less than 60-year-old reality in America. And that's really at the crux of this issue, that we're still grappling with this. We're still trying to adjust. We're still trying to accept black people as equal to white people. And if that makes you angry, or if that makes you shut down, it's really, right now, I want you to stop and take a deep breath and try your best to take that into account. I have a mentor, Mahmoud El-Qadi, who teaches at Macalester College. And he said, if somebody puts a noose around my neck and I struggle, that doesn't make me the racist. And so presenting this material, I'm the messenger of just straightforward American history. And so we wanted to establish that, because we can't have any conversation about race or racism in America without getting angry or shutting down when the words of white supremacy are uttered a lot of times, because we have to stop doing that. Because the truth is, white supremacy is our foundation. White supremacy is our heritage. White supremacy, the system, is a curse that we cannot even begin to break free of until everybody in this country can at least admit and agree on the fact that this was our governmental foundation until only a moment ago. We say this to preface the conversation that we're going to have. Secondly, we must understand the role that racial violence played in the white supremacist system. And that's not just the thousands of lynchings that were recorded by Brian Stevenson and his Equal Justice Initiative, but that's the stabbings, that's the shootings, that's the people who disappeared and were never heard from again, and many more. In my own research, I found that in my family history, since 1837, I've had a family member murdered every generation, mostly white on black, and mostly over two things: one, land; two, livestock. That's the persistent theme of our nation, especially when the nation was being formed, the capitalistic system. From the moment that American settlers wrested land away from the indigenous people and enslaved blacks to build it up, violence was a cornerstone of American capitalism. It's like we cannot, for as painful as that is, we can't not talk about that, because it's like looking at a graph without the x-axis. The graph wouldn't make any sense without it. And the system of white supremacy cannot be understood without racial violence. The history of America cannot be understood without understanding that white supremacy and racial violence are 2/3 of the equation. It was used to lynch black Americans, to assassinate our leaders, and to put many who were not killed under surveillance. The crime in the case of Dr. Martin Luther King was calling for nonviolent social change. And understanding that gets us closer to the understanding that Jim Crow segregation was not a system of separate but equal. That's not what it was. Jim Crow segregation, as I have studied it, and we will find out more with the forthcoming podcast and with my book, Nobody's Slave, was a crime against humanity, one that has yet to be recognized as such by our government, and by our president, Joe Biden. That is a fact. If we can't teach that reality in our classrooms, future generations can't even begin to understand American history. And no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, that's a problem. That's a travesty. Governor DeSantis in Florida says he plans to appeal a recent decision to block, quote, anti-woke legislation, unquote, which expands Florida's anti-discrimination laws to prohibit history that could cause people to, quote, feel guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress due to their race, color, sex, or national origin. And there are many more examples of this kinds of legislation being proposed across the country. America's legacy of racial violence is a major part of the podcast, as I said, that I'm hosting. And as we prepare our project, we thought it was important to make sure that we use Dr. Martin Luther King as a hyper-visible figure as opposed to my family, because Dr. King is someone who we all feel we know. We all feel that we love his story. He's not as much of a sort of divisive kind of figure, because everybody, if you think about on his birthday when it rolls around, everybody's quoting what he would have said and what he would have thought about this or that or the other. And we all love the story about Dr. King's beautiful dream. But today we're going to talk more about the secret nightmare, the horrifying events in Dr. King's life that produced PTSD caliber nightmares for Dr. King and his family. And when I read about him, I think about my own family and the things that I uncovered and how painful at times it's been, despite the stories of resilience and the power that I found in my ancestors as entrepreneurs and all of the things that they were able to do, not necessarily because of America, but despite America, and the wars that they served in when they didn't have voting rights, and all of that. Those are beautiful stories, but it's also been really painful, a painful several years working on this research. This summer I had the privilege of hosting a podcast with doctors from Mayo Clinic. Some of them were the world's leading experts on health and equity, and it was a Mayo Clinic conference in Chicago. And one of these brilliant people was a woman named Dr. Felicity Enders, PhD. She's a black woman and a professor of biostatistics at Mayo Clinic. She says that cumulative stress over a lifetime can age a person at a biologically swifter pace. That means their bodies at the cellular level are aging faster, as she puts it. She's developing a survey to measure and to estimate someone's accelerated biological aging by estimating how much stress that they've been under over the course of their lives. To that end, her work includes educating researchers on how to collect data, stressing that diversity and inclusion should always be a part of the process. She said that experiences such as growing up black under Jim Crow segregation or being one of the few people of color in a professional or educational setting can be stressful. And these are examples of stressors that might encourage medical professionals to examine patients for risk factors such as stroke or heart conditions, examples that have been overlooked until now. So this is really a growing part of research. And we're here not necessarily to make declarative statements, but we're going to provide the history and then allow you all to make your own inferences, and then to encourage you to continue to do more research on this as we do as well. And the issue really is brought into sharper focus when you look at Dr. King and his family as a case study. On January 30th, we can start there. Dr. King had just celebrated his 27th birthday. He was a pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. If you ever make it to Montgomery, it's a beautiful place. It's right down the street from the Capitol. He just started leading the Montgomery bus boycott. As he spoke at a church nearby, his wife Coretta and their 7-month-old daughter Yolanda were at the King home with a member of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Their home was bombed by an unidentified suspected white supremacist terrorist. There was a large crowd that assembled after the bombing. Luckily, they were not hurt, or thank God they were not hurt. But this is what Dr. King said to them. Remember, that is what God said. We are not advocating violence. We want to love our enemies. I want you to love our enemies. Be good to them, love them, and let them know you love them. On September 20th, 1958, Dr. King was signing books in the shoe section of Blumenstein's department store in Harlem. He was signing his first book, Stride Towards Freedom, The Montgomery Story. So this was right after the boycott that he helped lead. And while sitting there autographing book, a demented black woman came up to him. The only question that he had heard from her was, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And he said he was looking down writing, and he said yes. He said the next moment he felt something beating on his chest. Before he knew it, he'd been stabbed by this woman. He was rushed to Harlem Hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon. That blade had gone through, and the x-rays revealed that the tip of that blade had punctured the edge of his aorta. And once that's punctured, he knew you drown in your own blood. That's the end of you. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if Dr. King would have merely sneezed, he would have died. After his chest was open, after the operation, he was allowed to move around in the wheelchair in the hospital, and they allowed him to read some of the mail that came in. And there was a letter that came from a little girl, a young girl who was a student at the White Plains High School. And it said simply, "Dear Dr. King, I'm a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School." And she said, "While it should not matter, I want to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering. And I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. Well, Dr. King, I'm just writing to say I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze." The woman who stabbed him was Izola Ware Curry. She was 29 years old. She was a black woman, a daughter of a sharecropper, and she was found incompetent to stand trial. She was committed to a state hospital for the criminally insane after being diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. But what's really important here is to understand that during her interrogation, Ms. Curry proved the centuries-long indoctrination that white supremacy can pose, that people of all races, that white supremacists come in all shades, that people of all races can internalize racism and white supremacy. She accused civil rights leaders of, quote, boycotting and, quote, torturing her, as well as causing her to lose jobs. Through her and many others, we've learned, again, white supremacists come in all shades. On February 17, 1960, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Dr. King on charges of tax evasion. He was accused of allegedly falsifying his Alabama income tax returns for the years 1956 and 1958. So he came out of it having his house bombed and then getting stabbed, and then all of a sudden some mail from the IRS shows up. So he's testifying in his own defense, and he reveals that there was one worker at the IRS who was under pressure by his supervisors to find fault with his returns. He was the only person, Dr. King was the only person who was ever prosecuted under the state's income tax perjury statute. He described the trial in this way. The case was tried before an all-white Southern jury. All of the state's witnesses were white. The judge and the prosecutors were white. The courtroom was segregated. Passions were inflamed. Feelings ran high. The press and other communications media freedom struggle braced ourselves for the inevitable. After his indictment, Dr. King was asked by a reporter, "Have your income tax returns ever been investigated before?" He replied, "Oh yes, they've been investigated 2 or 3 times. This is nothing new." On May 28, 1960, he was acquitted. And then there was our government. Beginning in 1962, while all of this other stuff had happened, the FBI launched an extensive program of surveillance and harassment against Dr. King with the permission of U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. They tapped his phones. They tapped the phones in his home. They tapped his hotel rooms, office phones, those of his associates. They used round-the-clock surveillance to try to discourage and discredit Dr. King, according to FBI files. The agency also launched a smear campaign against him, which was circulated throughout the government and to journalists and to church leaders, among others. And the war on Dr. King didn't stop there. On September 28, 1962, in Birmingham, Alabama, he was giving the closing speech of the 4-day annual Southern Christian Leadership Conference meeting, and Roy James, who was a white man and a lieutenant stormtrooper of the American Nazi Party, sprung up from his seat and went to King on stage and punched him in the left cheek. He kept punching him in front of a screaming crowd and was subdued by a group of black men. Dr. King yelled, "Don't touch him." And then again, "Don't touch him. We have to pray for him." No one was harmed. No one harmed James. Instead, they prayed for him. As they prayed, Dr. King promised James that he would be safe and then took him into a private room, and the two men had a conversation. Dr. King declined to press charges. Mr. James ended up serving 30 days in jail and paying a $25 fine. On May 11, 1963, another King family house bombing. This time, the house of Dr. King's brother, A.D. King, was bombed while he and his family lay asleep. According to the King Institute at Stanford, angry protesters filled the streets after learning of the failed assassination attempt. A.D. came out to calm them. "My friends, we've had enough problems tonight. If you're going to kill someone, then kill me. Stand up for your rights, but do it with nonviolence." And it was on April 16, 1963, just months before the historic March on Washington, that Dr. King lamented the silence of the white moderate in his letter from the Birmingham jail. And I quote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice." Today, that reference would probably be aimed at people like Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones, who was recently reported by the Washington Post to be one of the crowd of white students standing in front of 6 black students trying to enter North Little Rock High School in 1957. He said he was there not because of racism, but because of curiosity. Or people like Senator John McCain, who voted against the establishment of the Martin Luther King holiday. Or it could have been Democrats like Albert Gore Sr., the father of Al Gore, who voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. April 3rd, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King described the stabbing again in his famous mountaintop sermon. It was his final address in Memphis, where he had returned to support the sanitation workers' strike. He revisited the "I'm so happy you didn't sneeze" letter from the little girl, and he said, I want to say that I too am happy that I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1963 when the black people of Birmingham, Alabama aroused the conscience of this nation and brought in into existence the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year, in August, to try to tell America about a dream that I had had. And amid the hell on earth that Dr. King had already been taken through, that night, he knew it would be his last. And they were telling me, no, it doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter with me now. It really doesn't matter what happens now. I left Atlanta this morning, and as we got started on the plane, the pilot came over the public address system and said, "We're sorry for the delay, but we have Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane. And to be sure that all of the bags were checked, and to be sure that nothing would be wrong on the plane, we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." Now think about that. You're sitting in a plane, and they say, "We've got John Liuzzi on the plane. Don't worry, we've had it protected all night." What is the psychological effect of that, of sitting there hearing that announcement? Then he said, we got into Memphis, and some began to talk about the threats or what could happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. And he said, well, I don't know what'll happen to me now. We got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. The next day, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. When the autopsy came out, that was when the real story started to come out. Dr. King's heart was assessed to be that of a 60-year-old, despite him being just 39 at the time of his death. The examiner concluded that King's stressful life may have contributed to the advanced aging of his heart. I'm sure a letter opener in his aorta didn't help. And the extended King family's trauma would then continue. After Dr. King was murdered, his brother A.D. King became a co-pastor at the family's Ebenezer Baptist Church along with Martin Luther King Sr. He also continued his work with the Poor People's Campaign and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. On July 21st, 1969, at the age of 38, A.D. King was found dead in his pool. He was in his underwear at the bottom of the pool. This was just over a year after Dr. King was murdered. He had 5 children. The Fulton County medical examiner in Georgia ruled it an accidental drowning, contending that A.D. was found with an alcohol content level of 3 times the driving limit. But his grieving widow, Naomi Ruth Barber, years then and years later called it a murder. She noted in an interview that A.D. was an excellent swimmer when he was alive. She added that when she saw him shortly after he was found, he had bruises across his forehead, he had dark rings around his neck, he had scratches and bruises on his stomach. She also stated that there was no water in his lungs. He was in the fetal position when he was found in that pool. She believed that A.D. was killed and then placed into the pool. But just to be clear, no foul play was ever confirmed. But one thing we all know, Miss Barber King and their children would be plagued with fear and grief, with all of the fear that one would experience in the face of bomb threats, the actual bombings, the death threats, and the actual murders, the assaults, the government harassment, the surveillance of Dr. King, and all the extended family members, both while it was going on and for years to come. The pattern of violent death in the family continued more from there. On June 30th, 1974, Dr. King's mother, Alberta, a 69-year-old woman, was playing the organ during Sunday morning service at Ebenezer when she was shot in the right side of her face by 21-year-old Marcus Chenault Jr. Mr. Chenault went on a shooting spree, and he actually killed a church deacon as well, named Edward Boykin. The entire King family was devastated by the assassinations of Dr. King and A.D. King, or at least the mysterious death of A.D. King and the grandmother King. The idea of black families being impacted intergenerationally by the legacy of racism in America is just beginning to be discussed in the mainstream. It would seem natural that any family that experiences this level of violence would be impacted health-wise by these atrocities. And in my work, I also looked into the Holocaust and the ripple effect that has on descendants. And it's very similar to the way that I grew up, the descendants of Holocaust survivors, having a father who went through what I believe to be a crime against humanity, Jim Crow, because both of his grandfathers were murdered. The idea of black families being impacted with this comes with a widespread lack of sensitivity toward the pain of families like Dr. King's. The idea that African Americans have a higher threshold for pain is very common in America, even among African Americans, unfortunately. One study that investigated the role of unconscious bias in a sample of 222 soon-to-be healthcare professionals. In that study, researchers found that about 50% of medical students and residents, including black residents, attributed higher pain tolerance to black patients compared to white patients. These students falsely believed that black people have less sensitive nerve endings, thicker skin, stronger immune systems, so therefore would require less invasive pain care than white people. A 2014 study asked participants to select whether they associated superhuman characteristics, including skin capable of withstanding the burn of hot coals and the ability to suppress hunger and thirst, with black or white people. Results published in Social Psychology and Personality Science showed white participants typically, quote, superhumanized, unquote, and attributed power capacities to black people in order to justify beliefs that they're inherently more resilient when hurt. Some experts call this superhumanization and some call it dehumanization. I think it's a little bit of both. But believe it or not, the King children, they were sad when their father was gone down. And believe it or not, the implications still affect them. Dexter King, for example, told CBS News that when he sees a breaking news flash, he feels overcome by PTSD, for it reminds him of his father's death, which still feels like yesterday. He feels that he's still healing and he hasn't had the chance to grieve. For a long time, he tried to learn to be as stoic as his mother, as she appeared to hold in her emotions, as if that's a good thing. In 2007, King's daughter, Yolanda, died at age 51. A spokesman for the family said the cause, quote, seemed to be related to cardiopulmonary problems. Out of A.D. King's 5 children, 3 of them have also passed away since his death. According to his widow, 2 have died of heart attacks. It was also reported that Martin Luther King Sr. died of a heart attack, and Coretta Scott King died of a heart attack. Today, a growing number of researchers are examining what's called a weathering hypothesis. The term was used in Columbia University for a study that demonstrated that chronic exposure to social and economic disadvantage leads to accelerated decline in physical health outcomes and could partially explain disparities in a wide range of health conditions. Amid all of this tragedy is the reality that we cannot begin to study or address the issue of accelerated aging or early death related to racism without first acknowledging that white supremacy has existed in this country, and without first acknowledging America's role in perpetuating it. Following the mass shooting in Buffalo in May, our President Joe Biden gave an emotional speech condemning the white supremacist ideology that led to the shooting. This is what he said. White supremacy is a poison running through the body politic, and it's been allowed to fester right in front of our eyes, he said, without mentioning America's role in injecting that poison for 400 years. And through the media, and through politics, and through the internet, these have radicalized angry, alienated, lost, and isolated individuals into falsely believing that they will be replaced, he said. That's the word, replaced by the other. Then he added to applause, I call on all Americans to reject the lie and condemn those who spread the lie for power, political gain, and profit. Today, we call on all of you to reject the president's lie that white supremacy started with the internet, that white supremacy started with the media, and not the 400-year system of governmentally codified white supremacy that socialized the white supremacists he condemned and has led to early death of black families for centuries. We present that at this time of great hostility in America toward teaching the hardest parts of American history. According to PEN America, a nonprofit that advocates for freedom of expression, at least 39 states had introduced 160 bills earlier this year, limiting what schools could teach about race, politics, American history, sexual orientation, and gender identity. That means that the information we're presenting today about the events that caused Dr. King psychological distress would likely be censored. And it's important to note that even if you don't accept that the heart attacks were caused by the stress, that somehow it was just incidental to these family members, the actual individual events of history are part of American history, regardless of how they make people feel in the classroom. There's no better place for us to deliver this message about the importance of academic and ideological freedom. Here at Marquette, you're in an atmosphere where the open exchange of ideas should be preserved and advanced. This is the place to explore new ideas and to expose yourself to information that may be difficult to digest, that may make us feel guilty, that may cause us psychological distress. But in the history of our world, there are many, many stories and pieces of history that could cause difficulty. Giving governments the power to censor education, to fear books, to ban books, goes directly against the mission of the university. But if Dr. King's family can be forced to live through the psychological distress of all these bombings, assaults, and murders, we can experience the discomfort of learning about it. Thank you very much. And I know there was a question or two, or we asked for questions, right? Okay. Oh, you have one? Okay, it's going to pull up the question. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay.
Lee, you mentioned Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, and John McCain. Can you talk a little bit more about why you mentioned those two together, and what did you think of their answers when they were asked about why they did what they did?
Yeah, well, I mentioned them in the context of talking about the silence of the white moderate that Dr. King referenced in his letter to the Birmingham jail. The whole idea of mentioning them was to provide some modern examples of people who would sort of potentially fit that description, because I was really, really kind of mystified by Jerry Jones's explanation that he was in the group of students who were blocking entry, but he wasn't there to block anybody. He was just there out of curiosity. And I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. You know, who am I? I can't say, only he knows the truth. But as a journalist then, I think a really good follow-up question would be, why didn't you say anything about it before? Because this is a man who's in a leadership position. We've had so many high-profile incidents of racism, especially George Floyd, that raised the consciousness of corporate America, and we had millions of people, but also billionaires and public figures stepping forward and talking about racism and how racism had impacted them personally in their lives, or how racism had impacted their colleagues or the people who work with them or the people who work for them. Never, ever did we hear him say anything about ever being there. And so I think if I had an opportunity to interview him, I would ask him why. Certainly these were iconic photos. I'm sure we've all seen the photos, right? As journalists, I'm sure we've been paging through and we've seen this photo in particular and just didn't recognize him. But certainly with all the years he's been on the earth since then, he would have recognized himself, but he kept that to himself. And so I would ask him why. The other thing was that I would also ask him to identify some of the other people who were in the picture. I mean, this is part of the hard part that we have to understand, that there were people in that picture, all of those young men. Now, some of them are no longer with us, probably many of them aren't, but some of them went on to lives and careers, and they were successful. And they were people who had impact on the lives of people of color, who had impact on the careers of people of color. And I wonder who some of them were. And I think that to me would be something that he could do right now. He could say, well, we had a meeting of all the guys who are still around who were in that, and we've decided that symbolically we're going to do this or that. Or let me tell you who this guy was or who that guy was. He's a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. He went on to do this, this, and this. And then would we go back and then see that there were racial discrimination cases filed against them? Or would we see that this person participated in redlining or racial covenants to keep black people out of certain neighborhoods? If they were in that picture and they weren't curious, then that's a big possibility. So that's why I brought him, not because I wanted to drag his name through the mud, but more because I'm just very curious about the posture that he took, and also even more about my colleagues in the press and why they didn't push him harder. And hopefully we'll hear more about that. The reason I brought up John McCain as well was because he voted against Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday being a national holiday, which when I was a kid, black people in the church, we didn't go to school and we didn't go to work for many years on that day. Our parents would send us to school with a letter that said, in recognition of Dr. King's birthday, we're keeping our children home. Please send homework. And then we would go to the state capitol in Minnesota and we would march from the church to the state capitol. We did this year after year after year after year until it became a national holiday. And then there were still states, including Arizona, that held out. Senator John McCain, who was someone who I respect, because I'm not a partisan person, okay? But I will tell you that I did, and I did respect him. And I do respect him in many parts of his legacy, some of his legacy. But I will tell you that when he voted against that, it made me think about the extent to which, through the generations, values change, okay? So what I mean by that is, how different are we from our grandmother or our grandfather in terms of our attitudes towards race? And I think that that's something that I'm still discovering, because I don't believe that people change that much. And in John McCain's case, it would make sense, because Doug Blackman, a former, just a really great writer, he wrote Slavery by Another Name, and he's done some really great work. He wrote about the McCains, the McCain family, and the black McCains, who still live in the area where John McCain was from. And it's really hard to come from being the grandson of slave owners to then all of a sudden being this progressive person on issues surrounding race. Doesn't mean it can't happen, because there are many people who have done it. But I think that when we find ourselves in the American story as participants in slavery, there's no reason to condemn people who are descendants. You can't hold them accountable for the sins of their forefathers, but you certainly can look at and start to dissect what they do with the present and what they do with the future, what they do with their bloodline, and what that will mean to future generations of that family. And I'm right now grappling with that in my own family. Part of my research for Nobody's Slave deals with the descendants of the slave owners who enslaved my great-great-grandmother, who I am related to by blood. Whether we like it or not, we are family. We are family connected by blood. And I will tell you that I have yet to have an experience where people don't want, on the other side, people don't want to talk about it, and people don't want to work together to do research on our family. I found the opposite. And maybe it's because people who are interested in genealogy are just that way. Because you have to not become desensitized to the history, but you have to just learn to understand that we can't change it. But what we can do, and what they have done for me, is to help me trace my family back further to that side of the family, and to understand the role then that all of that played in the way that I was socialized. How did slavery impact the way that my grandparents were raised? How did it impact the way that my parents were raised? How did it impact the way that my parents raised me? Because the only way that we can move forward as black people and as Americans is to actually go and identify the things that haunt us and that hold our bloodlines back, that hold us back as families and American families. I'll give you one more example and then I'll stop. But Mitch McConnell, Senator Mitch McConnell, when reparations was brought up as a discussion to Mitch McConnell, he said one of the funniest lines that I'd ever heard. He said, well, I don't think we can even begin to do it because we wouldn't know who to pay. We wouldn't know who to pay. And let me tell you something. If you dig into Mitch McConnell's past, he of all people knows who to pay. Because you go down to the county that he's from and you'll find black McConnells in that town who are descendants of slavery. And I think that that's really one of the big problems. That's the crux of this American problem that we have right now, is that we're not willing to accept the fact that not only are we on the opposite sides of slavery, but we are also family. And that there were people who for generations and for centuries were living in these small towns, knowing, well, this is this person's uncle, and that's my daddy, and this is, and walking around holding in these secrets of the American story at the family level. And what I'm starting to find out and experiment with is, can we begin to start to heal the wounds of our families at the family level, and the wounds of our country at the family level? And so that's what I'm exploring. And what I've found out so far is, when African Americans came over as part of the transatlantic slave trade by force, there were many people who didn't survive. But they kept pushing. And there were some people who made it. Frederick Douglass, as one of the last people in the last generations of slavery, became one of the most outspoken forces for emancipation. And you see what he was able to do for America and for Black America. Harriet Tubman, when you see pictures of her, you see pictures of her with a gun sometimes, right? Well, I don't know who she used that gun against, but I don't know if they were all Black people or all white people either, because the truth is, not everybody wanted to be free. Or people were afraid, that's what I'll say. There were people who were afraid to go. And I think that what that, to me, seems like is a metaphor for the larger community in America. Not everybody across the racial aisle wants to move forward as a united nation. Not everybody wants America to be free. And America will never be free until we deal with the original sin. And I think we've gotten to a place in my family, but also in my American family, where we have to be willing to leave people behind. That if you decide that you want to be a racist and a bigot, okay, be a racist and a bigot. You're not going to stop me. I'm moving forward. Because there are enough people now. There's a critical mass. There's a large plurality of people, especially if you looked at the protests with George Floyd, of people of all races that are ready to move forward. And so that's the most encouraging thing, and I think that's a good note for us to end on, is that if you're not, I don't even like, I mean, if you're not anti-racist, I don't like to use terms that are that prevalent in the lexicon, but there's no better word. If you choose not to be anti-racist, that's on you. But the key is that anybody who's smart about their own progress, even if it's not because they're just a decent human being, knows that it's bad business and it won't advance you in your life. If anything, it will ruin your life. And that's the proudest moment for me, is when I start to understand the role that African Americans have played in activism. That every stage of American history, we have been the people that have pushed America to be American, closer to the American ideal. It's been the African American, and I will not just say that the African American people, I will say the African American descendants of slavery and the African American descendants of Jim Crow. The people who have been here from the beginning and have fought through women's suffrage, who have fought through every stage, even when we didn't have basic rights, to push America to live up to the ideas in the Constitution. And so for me, I celebrate that. And I think that we now are going to have a more complex discussion about what that means. And how do we define what it means to be Black American in this country versus Black American descendant of slavery, Black American descendant of Jim Crow, and with the understanding that there are millions of people in this country who are living survivors of Jim Crow segregation. Millions of people who were never compensated for losing their vote, for losing their life, liberty, and happiness. And I'll save that discussion for next time. Thanks. All right.
This is the story of a boy who is very sensitive to lights and sounds. So he built secret hiding places where nothing could get in. The boy didn't like looking people in the eye. It made him feel uncomfortable. One day, he found out he had something called autism. His family got him help, and slowly, he learned how to live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org.